Hi, Rees.
So we were talking about, if you ask a kind of person like me who lives from my neck up, why we do these kind of treatments, I'll talk about things like, somatic pathways and neurobiology and anatomy. But you're going to slip off? All of this was carefully rehearsed. This is actually what we planned. It's a comedy show.
I'm actually more interested in boarding school trauma.
Oh, boarding school trauma. Well, I mean, look, we can talk about that. That was going to be the very short lead. Oh, hello. But you have a very different perspective on the embodiment of treatment, right? Because I can think about it in terms of you can talk about neuroscience, how you can get into your body, and I could go on about the polyvagal theory and things like that. But you bring a different perspective. It's almost from a different landscape, a different language. As you just said, there's something about it being a kind of cultural shift. And I think you might be saying some things about that this morning. But when it comes to actually the details of how people go back to their practice on Monday morning and what they treat, why is this so important?
I'm going to be a provocateur.
Great.
Because when we get back to, look, trauma is unspeakable. We know about that through the neuroscience of the brain and the body. And yet when I look at things through that ancient technology of song and story and movement and silence where we become loved into becoming, we're actually talking about an expanded conceptualization of secure attachment.
Okay.
It's secure attachment to land and to the rhythms and cycles of the seasons and where our food comes from and our hands in the dirt, and it's secure attachment to ancestors, our bloodline ancestors, as well as our activist ancestors, our professional ancestors who are here today. It's secure attachment to culture, which is more than language and food. It's the songs and stories and movement practices and silence that weaves its way through all rituals that mark the transition of humans over the course of a lifetime within a village setting within the land. And then, and then that gives rise to secure attachment to your body.
Can you securely attach to your laptop and sign in? Let this guy do something. Are we on? Are we working? In 3. Yeah. So.
Oh no, I don't want the slides up yet. Yeah.
Clicker is on. Click back.
Click back. Oh, fabulous.
Have an audience at home?
We do, yes.
We're live. We're up and running. Hello to everybody who is not here. Good morning, and for those of you who are just joining us who are not in this room on the live stream, especially fond welcome. We've been looking forward to your arrival. So I previously said thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you for making waves in our community. And I want to introduce Linda Tai now. So when I was 8 years old, I was in bed in my privileged little boarding school, waiting for my life of privilege and ease to happen. But on a beach in the middle of the night in Malaysia, a boat was upturned. And in that boat was a family of 3 people, a pregnant woman, a man, and a 1-year-old girl. They somehow got themselves to the shore, and they dug a hole in the sand to keep that 1-year-old girl warm. I, meanwhile, was sleeping in my bed. Now, you have on the stage here 2 journeys to this same room. My journey was pretty much expected. I was expected to end up in places like this. Can you imagine, though, the journey from that beach for that 1-year-old girl? On the way, Linda Tai has become a master teacher, a master educator, a master trainer, and a master practitioner of so many of the techniques that we will be hearing about this week. But there's so much more than just that. Linda has also become, if you like, a travel writer from this long journey. Now, sometimes you might think, wouldn't it be great to live in a post-patriarchal world, right? But it raises an interesting question. What does leadership look like in a post-patriarchal world? It doesn't look like me anymore. I can tell you that for free. But it does look like Linda Tai. So please, if you feel so moved, join me on your feet to honor and to show respect for, after the longest journey of all, the arrival of Linda Tai.
I was born in Vietnam. I was raised in Australia. I live these days in Fairbanks, Alaska, the traditional lands of the Dene Athabaskan peoples. And I'm redefining what it means to be Vietnamese and what it means to be Australian and what it means to be Alaskan. And I'd like to redefine what it also means to come together at the biggest mental health conference in Europe in terms of how we start. And so let us create, let's see, some sections here. So these folks down the bottom and this little area here. Yeah. If you like, call an echo. Healing is possible. Healing is possible. And then the sides and the upper area here, may it be so. This area here, healing is possible. Oh, no. Healing is happening. Healing is happening. May it be so. And then all together, and we'll call an echo. We believe. What we need most are the hearts of each other. Right here. Healing is possible. Healing is possible. May it be so. Healing is happening. May it be so. All together. We believe. What we need most are the hearts of each other right here. Are the hearts of each other right here. Wholeness. Wholeness is possible. Wholeness is possible. May it be so. Wholeness is happening. Wholeness is happening. May it be so. May it be so. We believe. What we need most are the hearts of each other right here. Are the hearts of each other right here. all together, transformation. Transformation is possible. May it be so. Transformation is happening. May it be so. We believe what we need most are the hearts of each other right here. Liberation. Liberation is possible. May it be so. Liberation is happening. May it be so. We believe what we need most are the hearts of each other right here. Well done. Tôi chào bạn và tổ tiên của bạn với sự kính trọng. Tên tôi là Thái Kim Ngọc. Tên cha tôi là Thái Văn Nam. Tên mẹ tôi là Dương Thu Hà. Gia đình tôi đến từ vùng Sóc Trăng, Việt Nam. Tôi rất vui và hân hạnh có được cơ hội hôm nay cùng các bạn. I greet you and your ancestors with respect. My Vietnamese name is Thái Kim Ngọc. My father is Thái Văn Nam. My mother Dương Thu Hà. My peoples come from Sóc Trăng in southern Vietnam, where the river meets the ocean, and yet we're upstream enough that the water is still sweet. I come from a family and a lineage of small-time merchants and traders and people who took care of the land and took care of each other. I'm the daughter of fragrant rice. I'm also a former child refugee, and so the tides of life swept me and my family to Australia via Malaysia, where we lived in a refugee camp for 6 months. My little sister was born there. And I come to you today from a place of love, like deep, deep, deep love. And in offering, and from this place, I'd also like to offer to you a land acknowledgement. So we are here today on the lands of the Atreides people. And this is pre-Roman invasion of England. And pre-Roman invasion of England, there were over 30 Celtic tribes, each distinct, own languages and variations of languages, own customs, own rituals and traditions for marking the passage of seasons over the course of a human lifetime. And I name this overtly because when we do land acknowledgements and we acknowledge the people of this lands, we actually acknowledge them as a peoples. And Australia has 500 tribes. North America, over 1,000. Central and South America, 850 nearly. And yet what happens with exonyms, names given to Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples, Aboriginals, they become one monolith, a colossal wall, a relentless sea. And so it's important to name the individual peoples, the tribes, the nations. And so the lands that I live on, Alaska Native Land, there's the Athabaskan, the Tlingit, the Haida, Shimsham, Artna. When I meet Europeans and I call you Europeans, you're like, no, I'm French, I'm Italian, I'm Dutch. And so to recognise the distinctness of culture is so important. Within this land acknowledgement, I also acknowledge, in terms of the people who are of the land, that resilience has been forced upon you. And I also see your strength, your joy, your laughter, and your love. I also acknowledge the land itself as a living entity that holds us all, and that the land that we are on is as a result of hundreds of years of bloody violence. I also acknowledge that we are here today in the heart of the dragon's lair of colonialism, a place of great beauty, great architecture, the bastion of science, and yet built upon unabashed racism, ecocide, rapacious greed, all for the power and the glory of the lion and the unicorn. And I thank you all for sitting with the bigness of this and the discomfort of this. Because as therapists, we know that being able to sit with discomfort is the pathway to truth and healing. Yeah? We will not achieve personal freedom or collective liberation without discomfort. And you are the people who help people to come to the truth of their own lives. And we know that the first task of grief is to come to terms with reality. And yet there is so much within our collective socio-political cultural systems that does not allow for multiple narratives to coexist simultaneously. And so today we're going to have a conversation about colonialism, unveiling the legacies in our modern day of colonialism. And I come to this conversation from a place of love, and from a place of love that's so big that it can hold us in this discomfort. And for me, this conversation began with the death of George Floyd. The murder of George Floyd, the public lynching of George Floyd. And at the time I was living in the United States, in Alaska, and I saw the conversations beginning to unfold around the racial reckoning in the United States. And yet on the other side of the pond, I saw that over here in the UK, it became a reckoning with colonialism. And I remember my friend Daryl saying to me, there's this statue of Edward Colston in Bristol. And he was a person who was born into wealth, who then became involved with the Royal Africa Company. And as a result of his involvement, 80,000 people from Africa were abducted and enslaved and sent to Virginia, as well as the areas of colonial territory for the British in Central America. 80,000 people, of whom 12,000 were children, branded like cattle with RAC on their chest. And in the United States, we're talking about cotton plantations becoming synonymous with slavery, and yet here in England, in Great Britain, is sugar synonymous with the enslavement and abduction of black and brown peoples? The 3-course meal, finished with dessert. Sugar. From sugarcane plantations elsewhere where we don't need to know about it. And so in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, people got together and congregated around the statue of Edward Colston, who had made his fortune in this way, and toppled this statue into the ocean. And when I heard this, I just started crying. Because while living in the US and reckoning with the racial history there, I had grown up in Australia. And there was a story of colonisation that I'd heard in Australia. And it was a simple narrative, very similar to the Christopher Columbus narrative, right? Except it was Captain Cook instead of Christopher Columbus. who sailed the seas and came to a land. And in the sailing of the seas, such bravery, such intrepid bravery by these early explorers to come to lands and to civilize the lands on behalf of the empire that they were a part of, and to bring the spread of Christianity to the uncivilized heathens. And yet, in the preparation of this keynote, I started talking to people. I was talking to an Italian friend last week in his late 50s, and I said, "Did you know that Christopher Columbus was Italian?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Have you heard of the doctrine of discovery?" And he said, "No." And I was talking to an American person yesterday who has Irish heritage, and I said, "Do you know about the history of how the Irish came to America?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Have you heard of the Irish potato famine?" And he said, "No." And other people that I've talked to have said yes. And then they said, "Yes, the potato famine. It was caused by the potato blight." And I love that there are so many of you in this room that are shaking your head. But growing up in Australia, I learned that the potato famine was caused by the potato blight. And that's why so many Irish are overseas. And during the 7 years of the potato famine in the mid-1800s, 1 million Irish emigrated overseas. 1 million Irish died. And in some parts of Ireland, it was 50% of the population. And then that set the stage for the 50 years afterwards of 6 million Irish leaving your homeland. And I had never paused for long enough to inquire about why the Irish only ate potatoes. And then I learned that Irish people have an abundance of crops and land and animals that you had a symbiotic relationship with. And the preconditions were that of English occupation. And so all your food was being sent off to the English upper classes, so that by the time the Irish potato famine happened, the preconditions were set in place for genocide through starvation. Yeah. I didn't learn this at school. And there's so much that we don't learn in school. And so when it comes to telling the truth, the reality, we actually have to acknowledge that the epistemicide is cultural. Yeah? Epistemicide means the killing off of all other possible origin stories and narratives. And it's so important that we educate ourselves about the context of history. And I wasn't the best history student when I was at school. And since hanging out with Bessel's been talking about history a lot. And eventually I decided it was time to learn a bit more about history. And then this gave me a context within which to place myself and my clients. And we actually have to tell the narrative from all sides. And so since the murder of George Floyd, conversations that we've been having around the world, there has been an outpouring now of stories about us, by us, and for us. And so we actually need to go back, and I'm not a historian, so I'm not going to bore you with a history lesson, but we actually need to pause and land into the story of Christopher Columbus, because it sets the stage. Yeah. So Christopher Columbus, long story short, was wanting to get to India, to South Asia, wanted to find a quick route, went westward, landed in Central America, and he called it the West Indies because he thought it was India. And that's why Native Americans are called Indians, right? The name, the exonym stuck. And with colonialism, it comes in 4 waves. So the first wave is the reconnaissance mission. Yeah. And in his reconnaissance mission, and I'll read this out. In his reconnaissance mission, he said of the Taino people, "They are so naive and free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would not believe it. When you ask for something they have, they never say no. To the contrary, they offer to share with anyone. And these are the people to whom he brought civilization. Yeah. So Christopher Columbus went back to Spain, where there was then subsequently a papal decree called the Doctrine of Discovery. And the Doctrine of Discovery, offered by the Catholic Church, and at the time, Europe was 99% Catholic. Yeah. And thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not murder does not apply to people who are not Christian, because you're not people. You're flora and fauna and occupants of the land. And so Christopher Columbus returned the following year, 17 ships. Yeah. So the second wave of colonialism is the genocide. It's the invasion. Yeah. And the people fought back, and they were met with more brutal violence and subjugation. And the people fought back, and they were met with even more brutal violence and subjugation. And so the people, the land, were extracted from, right, which is one of the core philosophies of colonialism, is extractivism. You have something that I want. Gold, cotton, sugar plantations, sex. And the bodies were used for target practice and sword practice. And it was common that war dogs were used to take the lives. And so when Columbus landed, 1492, 4 years later, the subjugation was in place and a census was taken. And of this region, there were 1.2 million Taino people 14 years and older. 12 years later, there are 100,000. Within 12 years, 1.1 million people have been killed. And this was before the introduction of disease. After the introduction of disease, 10 years later, there was only 11,000 people. From 1.2 million to 11,000 in 26 years. Christopher Columbus and his men would also hang people in groups of 13 to represent Christ and his 12 apostles. A ritual to mark the bringing of Christianity to these unchristian heathens. 5,000 people were also enslaved and sent back to Europe, and so Christopher Columbus is also noted as the first enslaver of peoples. And so this set the stage for the Portuguese, the Spanish, the English and the French. Within 100 years of Christopher Columbus's landing in Central America, the indigenous populations of Central America and South America had been reduced by 90%. Things that we don't learn in school. Yeah. Growing up in Australia, I wasn't told about anything in terms of the Aboriginal peoples. And when we're not told the truth, then stereotypes and assumptions move into that space. The assumptions of laziness, the assumptions of poor morality, the assumptions of a broken peoples. But really, Indigenous land-based cultures have had an ongoing relationship with the land for tens of thousands of years. And when I first started working in Alaska, I didn't know anything about the history of colonialism. And I started to learn. And then one day I find myself on the wild west coast of Alaska in a village called Bethel, teaching as part of the human services program there, and the class is entirely Alaska Native. I was one of two non-Native peoples in the room, and we sat in circle. There were 3 Alaska Native elders there, and these people all spoke Yupik and Chupik as their first languages. And so they loved it when I would drop words in Vietnamese into my sharing. I shared with them the ACEs study, and they looked at me and they said, "Oh my, we feel so hopeful." Because we thought that there was something wrong with our peoples, that there's so much addiction and domestic violence and abuse. And then I shared with them some of the history of colonialism and the trauma of colonialism and how that impacts people transgenerationally and intergenerationally, and started to share about residential schools, which their parents and grandparents hadn't told them about because trauma is unspeakable. And their hearts broke open. And I share this with you because we make so many assumptions about what we think everyone knows. And to offer this in ways that are trauma-informed and compassionate and human, while also acknowledging our place in the scheme of things. Right, as social workers, as mental health clinicians, we talk about the biopsychosocial spiritual approach. Well, maybe it's biopsychosocial spiritual structural assessment. And when we look at micro, meso, macro factors of someone's ecological system, we forget the chronological system. And it's important to take this into account because we know from our work in working with addiction and trauma that it happens within systems. And so to acknowledge that those systems are concentric circles outwards, are all part of these systems. I'm just going to take a pause, so let's all take a breath or two. To metabolize. To metabolize, because I share these stories as an evocation, not as an education. Yeah, it's an evocation, not an education. And I invite you to pause into the narratives that you've been taught and told about, and to become curious about the epistemicide that has been present in your culture, your country, your lived experience. And the pause to breathe is a pause for metabolism. And metabolism is an alchemical metabolic process by which we create fuel and nourishment and sustenance for our own growth. And in this metabolic process of meeting the truth, meeting reality, the byproduct of this metabolic process is grief, as well as our defense mechanisms. And so to pause and land there, right, the discomfort that is inevitable for our growth. And so there's so much grief in what happened that shouldn't have happened, and also what didn't happen in terms of the telling of these narratives that should have happened. I remember sitting there with a client, Alaska Native woman, mid-50s. And at the time, the residential schools in Canada were becoming exposed as part of the structure and institutions by which racism is enacted. And there were the images of the graves of little children and people around the world reckoning with this history. And my client comes into the office and she sits down, starts crying. And I have a chair that's on wheels, like a little stool. And so I sit on it and then I scoop myself round, so I'm sitting right next to her. And my side body is pressing against her side body, just ever so gently. And when I make that contact, her body leans into mine. And her hand starts to do this. And so I place my hand in her hand. And she says, I just realised that my parents and my grandparents were sent to residential schools. It's a woman in her 50s. And then she says, and so was I. And I sat with her in the reckoning and the grief that emerged. Body to body, breath to breath. And then I waited for that wave of nervous system activation to move through and land. And I looked at her and I said, but it didn't happen to the 4th generation, to her 2 adult daughters. And the amount of grief that just moved through requires a human-to-human connection. And it's the presence of one nervous system with another nervous system. And my invitation for you all, when you begin to learn the history, is to connect to communities where you can move this grief through so that when you are with other people, you can be with them in their grief. Grief is close friends with rage, and grief is close friends with terror. So when that grief emerges, do not be surprised if rage and terror also emerges, because so many of us keep a lid on our grief out of that survival response, but also because we know that terror is right there, that rage is right there. And so also to do this work and find these communities for yourself. One thing I've learned from working with Alaska Native peoples, as well as working with my own story of French colonisation, as well as working with trauma survivors, is that in lieu of a context, we make it mean something about ourselves. That there's something fundamentally wrong with me. My client said to me that my dad didn't love me and that my mum didn't love me. But the reality was, as we began to unpack it, was that her parents were sent to boarding school at such a young age that their development got truncated, so they didn't know how to be with her beyond the age of 8. So after she was 8 years old, she was on her own because her parents didn't know how to raise her, because that was when they stopped being raised and nurtured. And this is a story that's also common for many of us in this space. And so in this moment, I'd like to invite up onto stage Daryl Toulon. Daryl is from Dominica, descendants of the Kalinago people and close cousins with the Taino people. And Daryl, in his work with children who were born of wartime rape in Uganda, has helped them to discover a new narrative about what it means to know that one's father has been used as an instrument of forcible displacement and genocide. And the song that Daryl will sing has the words in it, "It's not your fault. It's not my fault."
Thank you, Linda. I also stand here at the center of the Dragon's Lair, as Linda has said. I come from the small island of Dominica, and I did go to school here in England at at the moment I live in Vienna, but my work takes me, thank God, all over the world. I would like to share a song with you that was written, the lyrics were written by Ambrose, who was born in captivity. Ambrose's mother is one of those hundreds of teenage girls who were abducted in the 90s and taken to the camps and made into forced mothers and wives to the commandants and the soldiers of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. This was a project that gave those invisible, silenced and stigmatized children, 15 of them who worked with me, the possibility to find themselves, to accept their biographies, and through artistic work to transform this into something of beauty. I would like to share this song with you. I would like you to join with me, to give your voice to the silenced. I have also recently taught this song to a group of people in the South Philippines, where I carried on a peace-building with performance arts workshop. It was intergenerational, interethnic, intercultural, interspiritual. And on the other side of the world, the children from Uganda, their voices were heard. And maybe you can join with me. The first part is, I know it is hard to live without the love of your father. I know it is hard to live without the love of your mother. I know it is hard to live without the love of your brother. I know it is hard to live without the love of your sister. Our children who were born in the bush, it was not your wish to be born in the bush. Our children who were born in the bush, it was not your fault to be born in the bush. Angeo meko abongo marababani. Angeo meko abongo maramamani. Angeo meko abongo mara omini. Angeo meko abongo mara amini. Otinoa ameon walogilum bedo mitiwu men waloilum Otinoa ameon walogilum bedo mitiwu men waloilum. Would you like to join me? You take over the easy bit, I do the hard bit. Otinowa is children born in the bush. Just a little aside, it was my fantastic, I say this with a lot of irony, idea that those children, after working with me, would stand on stage and sing to their communities, to their mothers, to other people from the area, that we were born in the bush. This almost did not happen because one said the worst thing somebody could say to you is you were born in the bush. Another one said, this is after 6 weeks of work, yeah, but that's what we are, and that's why I want to sing it. It was only possible to sing this song in a combination of artistic work and psychotherapeutic work with a psychologist who got those children to say, okay, now is the chance. Come on, we have a song, we have a frame. We can make it work. Just give it a go and see what happens. And so eventually we did. We stood on stage and we sang it. And I would like you to join me. Otinoa, 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 Ameone walogilum, Ameone walogilum. Beautiful. Can we do this one more time? Otinoa, 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 Ameone walogilum, Ameone walogilum. I'll take the heartbeat. Peo pero miti wu. And you join me with Menwalo uilum, to be born in the bush. Menwalo uilum. I say it was not your fault. You didn't want this. Peo pero miti wu, Menwalo uilum. Let's go. And Otinoa, Otinoa, Ameone walogilum. I'll take it. Peo pero miti wu, Menwalo ilum. One more round, here we go. And Otinoa, Otinoa, Ameone walogilum. Peo pero miti wu, Menwalo ilum. Thank you.
It's not your fault. Yeah, it's not your fault. I get invited to offer a refugee mental health training into a clinic that services the needs of recently resettled refugees. And in the United States currently, 21% of black people are African-born or the children of African-born. And they consider themselves to be very distinct from the descendants of enslaved peoples, because when you go to the US or any other colonised nation, there is a racial hierarchy that just becomes apparent. The invisibilisation of and erasure of Indigenous people, and then the descendants of enslaved peoples. Yeah. And the darker you are, the lower down you are. I asked this room of clinicians, of 35 clinicians, of which 3 had lived experience of seeking refuge themselves, and these 3 were also people of the global majority. And I said, how many of you actually know the history of Africa? Put your hand up if you've watched a YouTube video, read a blog, maybe even read a book. 4 people put their hands up. And I said to them, yeah, how many people in this space know the history of the colonial history of Africa? I'm so impressed. Yeah. In this room, in the room that I was in, it was 4 out of 30. And I said to them, what gives you the right to work with people when you don't know their history? And I'm not saying don't work with people that are not like yourself, but maybe you could get to know the history. And so I started sharing about the Berlin Conference in 1885, where the European superpowers got together for a gentlemanly agreement to slice up Africa like a piece of pizza, so to prevent European bloodshed. And yet within this epistemicide that still exists today, we all have the narrative that there's nothing in Africa. It's a lost continent. The people there are starving and bereft, and there's no natural resources. And yet we have in the modern age colonialism by corporations, where the people of the land don't get to have a say in their land, and they're living in the aftermath of the destabilisation of power. They're living in the aftermath of genocide. King Leopold of Belgium, known as the Butcher of the Congo, committed genocide to 10 million Congolese. And he kept doing what had been happening under Christopher Columbus. There is a quota. You meet the quota. If you don't meet the quota, we'll cut your hand off. Yeah? We'll brutalise you so that we can meet the quota, whether it was for gold, sugar, cotton. Yeah. Growing up in Australia, the only genocide I ever learnt about was the genocide of Jewish people during the Holocaust. And I want to no way diminish, demean, or compare genocides. It was a genocide that happened here in Europe, and you could not look away. And yet there was an embrace of it, because you go to Berlin and there are cobblestones everywhere that say, you know, what happened here? And yet throughout the southern parts of the US, still here today throughout Great Britain, there are statues that revere, uphold the brutality of colonialism. Yeah. And within our epistemicide, we don't learn about the genocide of black and brown bodies, historically or presently. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We get to the late 1800s, evolutionary biology becomes co-opted by racists. Because there is, through science, the proving of an inferiority and a superiority in terms of race. And so if you disagreed with genocide, then you were clearly ignorant about the inherent superiority and inferiority within the human race. And that these people, doctrine of discovery continued, are actually not human. Australian Aborigines in Australia only got recognised as people and as citizens in 1969. Yeah. Yeah. And we still don't talk about the history of slavery in Australia. And for me growing up, what I was told is we're not like the US. There was no slavery here. But we weren't even taught about the genocide of Indigenous Australians. And yet, after the British, declared that slavery was no longer and engaged in reparations by paying money to the people who'd lost their wealth, not to the enslaved peoples, and that those reparations only were completed within the last 10 years. These colonialists then went, well, we can't enslave people openly. Let's go to South Africa and let's go to Australia. And this is not talked about in Australia, that there were 60,000 people stolen from the South Pacific Islands and brought to Australia to work in the cattle ranches alongside Australian Aborigines, but also would work in the sugarcane plantations and in the pearling industry. Pregnant women were considered to be the most sought after for the pearling industry because it was thought that their lungs were bigger. And if your pearl diver lived for 3 months, then you had made your return on investment. Yeah. And so here I'd like to offer a quote by Alokvade Menon. People in power make hierarchies and stereotypes seem natural in order to make inequality seem inevitable and permanent. The best way to eliminate a group is to demonize them, such that their disappearance is seen as an act of justice and not discrimination. And Alok comes to this as someone with a non-binary identity. And so with the export of colonialism, you get the export of who is property and who can own property. We see the export of the patriarchy as well. And it becomes normalised over time that you ask, that in the cis hetero dynamic, the man asks the future bride's father for permission for the hand in marriage, and then the father walks his daughter down the aisle to give her away. It becomes normalised. And so in order for there to be property, who is property, who owns property, we need laws, we need systems of governance. And that's what capitalism is. It's an ideology reflected in our institutions around private ownership. And in order for there to be private ownership that then gets passed on as a legacy and inherited, these laws need to be upheld within the nuclear family and within the patriarchy in terms of the passing on of property. And so the cis hetero normative paradigm becomes exported to the rest of the world. In pre-colonial Africa, there were over 40 tribes documented who have an expansive conceptualization of gender identity. In Mexico, there's a Mushe. In South Asia, the Hija. North America, Two-Spirit. And then what happens, because trauma becomes decontextualized over time, especially with erasure of other stories and other narratives, is then we start to think that that my people are homophobic, that my people are transphobic. But it's not. It was the imposition through coloniality and Christianity of the gender binary. Trans people have always been here. And then the irony of it is that people with proximity to power, so white, trans and queer folks, use their voices, and I love that. And then their allies use their voices, and I love that. And yet without this context of history, I then feel that there's something wrong with my people and that the white queer world is liberating, black and brown queer bodies. Not true. Not true. And so here I'll show you this image. Rupa Maya and Raj Patel. That which is so embedded in our culture that we don't pause to become curious about the structures that we have inherited that are normalised in our socio-cultural political context. Christianity is missing. And in working with complex developmental trauma survivors, I see all of these at the individual. When you are othered, your internalised devaluation, an assaulted sense of self, learned voicelessness, psychological homelessness, complex ambiguous loss and collective grief, and orientation towards survival, and so much rage beneath the surface. But we know that certain bodies are allowed to be rageful and others aren't. Dr. Kenneth Hardy says that these are the invisibilised wounds of racialised trauma. And I think it's important to make this distinction because we often come into contact with clients and we see these indicators of complex developmental trauma, and we then hyperfocus within the family system. And then we can perhaps be barking up the wrong tree because the ladder's up against the wrong wall. I had good enough parenting. But what does good enough parenting mean within a society where the institutions and systems offer pervasive messages and messaging of insecurity? In my work with my clients, I've noticed that these invisibilised wounds also lateralise outwards. My disabled clients, my neurodivergent clients, my trans and queer clients. And their good enough parenting isn't enough in this world. And in this world, we all suffer because we all have that wound of not enough. And so coloniality is more than, it's more than all of these systems and structures. It's a way of being, it's a way of moving, it's a way of reshaping and contorting ourselves in order to be able to survive. This list is known as the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And yet I also see this list as indicators of modernity. And so I hope that we can expand the conversation beyond racism, beyond cisgenderism, and to begin to have the conversation about modernity. And that our experiment at modernity is showing the results. And I often hear in social justice circles, like the conversation around individualism versus collectivism. We need to start caring more about other people than what we do about ourselves. And yet Vanessa Andreotti says this conversation about individualism versus collectivism comes from a paradigm rooted in anthropocentrism, where we centre ourselves as humans. And when we start to look at land-based cultures, they live on a paradigm that she calls metabolism, that we're part of the larger metabolic processes of the earth. I hope that I have been provocative enough to evoke a curiosity. And where I'd like to land us towards is that hope is a practice. Love is a practice. Liberation is a practice. It's not an end goal. And if we relate to it as an end goal, then we're thinking about it in terms of, this way of thinking. And this practice requires discomfort and inconvenience. And modernity will sell us comfort and convenience. And in the spirit of practicing discomfort, in the spirit of practicing hope and practicing liberation, I'm going to invite up on stage Dr. Keisha Siraboy to sing a song of liberating.
For those of you who held space with me last year, I see you and I thank you. I want us to experience what I felt last year when I sung a song of my ancestors. And when I was given this opportunity to return, the song that I chose is another protest song, another song of hope, another song tied to the ancestors, but this time, this is a song that has traveled around the world. And I want us to to sing, "We Shall Overcome," because I feel like that is the song that connects what we just heard today, that connects to the universal ancestral theme of we shall overcome. Trauma is not exclusive to any culture, but we have all had people in our bloodlines that have said, no, we can sit in this discomfort, we can sit in this hard truth, but we will not stay here. And I don't say that to move you past or rush the process. You take as much space as you need. I want to put this song in front of you to put seed in the ground. And as we sing this song, "We Shall Overcome," I want you to imagine whatever mountain, whatever burden, whatever is currently in your way that you need to overcome as you take what you're learning at this conference and you start thinking about, how am I going to apply it? There are going to be moments where it's going to seem impossible. And that's when I want you to think about this moment that we're about to share and remind yourself, as your ancestors did, that we shall overcome, even if we don't see it in our lifetime. I love the story you shared. It did not happen to the fourth generation. I don't know what generation is going to be able to say we have overcome, but I know collectively we are going to be a part of the ancestral choir that has sung "We Shall Overcome." And if you don't know the words, I am honored to share them with you now. The first stanza is, "We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday." Those are the words. The way it has been sung in protest rallies, it has been sung in monumental moments of history. One of my favorites is a picture during the Civil Rights Movement. Everyone is standing, and if you're comfortable, I invite you to hold the hand of the person next to you. To my online community, I invite you. Yes. To my online community, you are in this space with us. I invite you to sing right where you are. This is a moment of collective unity. So I encourage you to stand, those who are able. I invite those who are comfortable to hold the hand of the person next to you. And we are going to sing from our soul. That first time around was gentle and it was soft, and that was fine because it was meant for us to make sure we had the words and we were together. But this time, we're going to sing in a way that invites the ancestors to come into the mouth of the dragon's lair and put this word in the soil that we shall overcome. And this year, we're doing it together. You ready? Yes. Don't leave me out here, guys. I'm going to be really emotional because this is powerful work, and we're doing it with authentic intention. And I love that I'm wearing the word heal. May this be a healing moment for you all. You ready? 1, 2, 3. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart,
I want you to turn to the person next to you. Make eye contact. And one person will say, my liberation is bound to your liberation. I am not free until you are free. And then switch. My liberation is bound to your liberation. I am not free until you are free. As you walk through Oxford, offer this as a mantra to the trees, to the air, to the earth, to the non-humans and humans. There is so much hope in this room. Thank you.